Chapter 11 Evaluation Test Part 2. Everything changed about the atmosphere the moment the lady declared. Northern felt himself pressed upon by a heavy force, only that there was no visible heavy force. Whatever this was, his guess was that it was the lady's talent ability and he had to deal with it somehow. But how? He was impressive thus far. He had learnt a lot and even managed to several times outsmart those kids back in the countryside who were newly awakened. Other things he had learnt from several practice duels from his father, but he didn't take any class on dealing with talent. More importantly, he had never thought about a talent like this one. And/o/bell/b//in.c//ohm. If her talent allowed her to instill fear in her opponent, under what type would it be? Scholar. Hunter. No, the entire prejudice was wrong. She was clearly a hunter class from the way she spoke about spiritual release. Northern gritted his teeth as he tried to resist. The way the lady looked, her brute appearance, the scars and her feral face, she gave off the vibe of someone that would be more powerful than his own father. He came out once and he already met two people that could be far stronger than his father. To think his father was actually the strongest in the countryside. Northern could be missing a lot staying hidden in that place and he was beginning to realize it. What? The lady clicked her tongue. A moment ago you were looking very cocky, now you can't raise your head anymore. Northern was struggling with the effect of the pressure upon his head. It was incredibly hard for him to resist the domineering force that pressed him down, and it was even harder to breathe in her presence. There was no way out. Almost. Northern narrowed his eyes to a slit as a possibility occurred to him. Currently, the lady's talent ability was solely focused on him. What if she had the ability that enabled her to target a person and not an area? That should change everything, right? All he just needed was 1 second of relapse, and for him to get it, he needed an element of surprise. A devilish smile formed on his face, even though his head was bowed and being pressed down. The woman could feel that the young kid was happy about something. The pressure on Northern suddenly increased. He fell to his knee and coughed out blood. The lady raised a brow as she saw him. Her countenance broke apart, pity filling in. She lifted her hand to stop it but frowned the next second. Gotcha. She swung her face to the side. It was too late for her. Her feral face was met by the flying punch of another Northern whom she had no idea where he had come from. Northern smiled and slowly rose up. To her shock, the Northern in front of her shattered and became a dust. A tense frown covered her face. She didn't understand what was going on. I've been fighting a clone all the while. Northern had managed to land a punch but he wasn't having a good time with it at all. The lady's face was unscathed, unfazed. When he landed the punch, it was like he punched into a metal wall. A jolt or breaking pains ran through his hand. Till now, as the woman turned and asked the question, Northern was still dealing with the pain, swinging his hand voraciously. Hey. Brat. I'm talking to you. The lady grabbed and lifted him by the wrist of the hand that was paining him. Northern stared deadpan at her, sighing lamely before speaking. It was before you even came. I wanted to test out something with my talent ability so I decided to place a clone at the counter while I check around the place. There were several reasons for what he did. The main reason in fact wasn't because he predicted a fight with the woman. Northern wanted to know how cloning worked. The thing he was most concerned about was the amount of information that the clone could receive. How information was perceived and whether he could pass a mental command. To his surprise, everything was better than he had thought. The clone was able to perfectly mirror the things that went on in his head. For a fact, Northern felt like the clone was a better fighter than he. The informations he passed to it were executed instantaneously. There would have been an element of almost if he was the one in the fight. He seriously was considering pushing the clone to battle all the time. But then he wasn't a lazy-natured person. All this was just a coincidence. He had no plan to enter into the fight from the beginning, which meant even though he was required to do so, he wasn't going to use his talent. But some things began to spiral out of his speculations. 1. He thought the fear being instilled in him was the woman's talent ability. If it was, why was the system not asking if he wanted to copy it? 2. His clone was doing an amazing job containing the whole situation but was a few seconds away from breaking apart. And he could feel it vividly in his own body. When the clone shattered and dissipated, it felt like a small part of himself had returned. And that was the summary of all that had happened. Yes. Yet, the whole scenario from the woman's point of view was different. She clenched her teeth. Her brows furrowed viciously. You dare to deceive me? It was not my fault that you didn't notice that I have been using my talent since the beginning. Fine, let's say, I played too smart for you to catch on to. You were so focused on using your talent ability to deal with me that you couldn't detect an attack from behind. Northern continued coldly. Trust me, if I was half as strong as you are, you would have died twice. Firstly, when you decided to use spiritual release and didn't attack me for real because I most definitely would have seen it coming. Secondly, just now. The boy's words were annoyingly right. Annette was a very strong awakened, she was feared even amongst her peers and was an experienced hunter who had even lost one of her eyes to a rift raid. She was strong enough to be recruited and given special treatment by the headmaster of the public citadel of Crownder City even though she had a lousy character and was an unredeemable drunkard. She was special and it wasn't just because of her strength. The complications and speciality of her talent ability also contributed to it. And someone like her was outsmarted by a kid. How? How did you do it? Northern replied he with a bored look, saying nothing. How did you sneak up behind me? She yelled at him. A frown fell on his face. What a nice way to ask for guidance. The lady repelled her head, her brows frowning unbelievably. There was no trick to it. You were focused on him. I just needed to make the timing be when you were more focused than usual. Which happened the last minute. I crawled all the way, then last minute, I jumped with my punch. Which was pretty much useless as you can see. He pointed dully to the hand she was holding. To think she'd been had with such simplicity. Did I loosen up too much because there was nothing to worry about or have I just gotten rusty since I lost my eye? Annette sneered and released his wrist. He threw her an irritated scowl before caressing the poor wrist. While he was doing that, Annette brought out a piece of paper and scribbled a few things then tucked it back in. The life in her expression had died since Northern finished giving his explanation. She turned unceremoniously and said as she walked away. Follow me. We'll be conducting the second part of the test indoors. Chapter 12 Senile Young Boy. Gilbert and the 10-year-old looking boy were seated in an office, slanted rays of light filtering through and lending a warm radiance to the space, banishing strange shadows to the corners. Rustberg glanced around before remarking, You still keep those here. His voice trailed off as he eyed the lingering shadows, prompting the headmaster to fix him with a serious expression. The atmosphere became taut with tension. After a prolonged silence, Rustberg sighed and shook his head. You are an excruciatingly dull human being. When will that ever change? Gilbert shrugged, his serious mien unwavering as he regarded the boyish figure seated across from him, separated by a round table bearing 2 coffee mugs. Finally, Gilbert's gruff voice rumbled forth, laced with respect. Why are you here? Rustberg took a cursory sip of coffee before responding, a hint of mischief in his tone. It's nothing serious. After being cooped up in Milgard for centuries, can't an old friend enjoy a change of scenery now that there's a new principal? Gilbert stared at him impassively for a few beats before replying. No. No, I know you too well. You didn't travel over 800 kilometers just to catch up with old friends or for some fresh air. Cut the lies. Grandmaster Rustberg. Rustberg's face crumpled comically, as if he were about to burst into tears. But the expression swiftly hardened as he retorted, Isn't this child's face amazing? Gosh, I can scarcely remember the last time I was an actual kid. He traced his youthful features with tiny fingers as he mused aloud. Are you going to keep beating around the bush? Gilbert pressed, his patience waning. Things are getting serious at the border, Rustberg said, his tone taking on a somber edge that commanded Gilbert's rapt attention. I wish there was something that could have been done to prevent an entire continent from falling to the monsters. Every time I dwell on the past, I'm consumed with self-loathing over such a grievous mistake. The misfortune that befell Celia could have been averted if the leaders of the Central Plains had acted decisively. But ultimately, the fault lies with me for waiting on them. He sighed heavily and took another contemplative sip. But what's done is done. If we don't take swift action, the protectors won't be enough to stop those monsters from encroaching on the Central Plains. But the Central Plains is different. Gilbert protested. Of all 5 continents, ours is the most civilized. But not the strongest, Rustberg cut him off, his eyes hardening as a frown creased his boyish features. I've witnessed drifters from the northern continent who surpass even our mightiest. I fear that if monsters begin seeping into our lands, coupled with the growing plague of rifts, it won't be long before we too are cast into the depths of oblivion. His voice thickened with pain and quiet desperation. Nothing will remain of us. Nothing. Gilbert watched him impassively, allowing the heavy silence to linger before speaking in a measured tone, his eyes lowered. I suppose you've come here because you have a solution in mind. Rustberg leaned back, his dangling legs barely brushing the floor. Yes, I have a solution. And I need you to see it through. Gilbert's eyes slid shut as he shook his head wearily. We've had this discussion before, Master Rustberg. Under no circumstances will I return to the academy. There is no place for me there any longer. Gilbert, listen to me. Gilbert raised his gaze to lock with Rustberg's intense stare. I have a plan to cultivate a special batch of students. Gilbert squinted skeptically as the boyish figure continued undeterred. They are going to be different from any drifters ever seen before. I intend to forge them through the harshness of the dark continent itself. Stop. Gilbert's voice sliced through the air with a sharp intensity they had yet to hear. I know exactly what you're scheming, Master Rustberg. You need say no more. I spent 30 years in your service, of course I understand how your mind works. You aim to take a group of students and abandon them in the heart of a monster-ruled continent. Rustberg averted his gaze, his expression guarded but telling. Seeing that reaction, Gilbert knew he had struck the heart of the matter. Rustberg did indeed intend to send a contingent of youths into the nightmarish depths of the dark continent. It was so intrinsically him, the former academy principal would go to any lengths, no matter how extreme or unjust, to achieve his desired ends. Rustberg cared not for the means, only the results. A disquieting trait that made Gilbert incredibly wary of the ancient man-child. It makes no sense. He raised his voice, leaning forward as he gesticulated emphatically. Grandmaster Rustberg, you're going to take actual people and consign them to the heart of a monster-infested land simply to safeguard our continent. You know full well they won't last a single day in that hellish place. Rustberg waved his tiny hand dismissively. What do you mean going to? PFFFT, don't you think it's a tad late to be lecturing me about changing course? Gilbert's face drained of color as realization set in. No. You didn't. But Rustberg nodded his childlike head smugly. Oh yes, I did. This project began 3 years ago. I've already sent 3 batches of students there so far and lost all communication with them. They're dead. The word stuck in Gilbert's throat like glass shards. No, they're not, Rustberg countered, shaking his head. I created a life lantern for each and every one of them. Some have perished, yes, but it's not even a quarter of them. With 100 students per batch, 300 have been sent over the past decade. Yet I've not heard a whisper from any of them. The deaths seem like something quite natural. Gilbert's brow furrowed darkly at those chilling last words. Something natural. How could someone so callously regard the deaths of students, children sent to face horrors no one should ever have to endure, as natural? Rustberg's moral rot was undeniable, but Gilbert still held immense respect for the ancient schemer. He might carry this reprehensible personality, but I owe him my life. Slowly, Gilbert mastered his turmoil, his eyes unfocusing as he retreated into deep contemplation. When he finally spoke, his tone was carefully measured. Which means they yet live. But are stranded in a place beyond your ability to make contact. Precisely, Rustberg confirmed with a nod. The diminutive figure was not merely the preeminent scholar of their age, he was a savant rank high magus, the strongest and most erudite academic mind in the 5 continents. Rustberg had long since mastered the theoretical limits of scholarship, delving into the esoteric realms of conceptual magics like time, gravity and space. It was this arcane genius that enabled him to send hundreds of students into the dark continent's depths without ever setting foot there himself. Gilbert didn't know the intricacies of how Rustberg had achieved such a feat, but he understood one fundamental truth: if the ancient magus admitted to losing contact, then he was never meant to lose contact in the first place. A single, disquieting conclusion loomed. Does this imply some manner of anomaly? Most likely some monster we've never encountered, Rustberg posited. Bravely. There are hundreds upon hundreds we've yet to catalog, Master Rustberg, Gilbert pointed out. True, but this one feels different. Rustberg leaned forward, his eyes alight with determined curiosity. Damn it, you know how finely tuned my instincts are, Gilbert. There is something lurking in that forsaken land that has eluded all our notice thus far, and I intend to unravel its secrets. Gilbert sighed, knowing there was no swaying the ancient schemer when his mind was made up. For all his moral shortcomings, Rustberg's contributions to the Central Plains were immeasurable. Besides, it wasn't as if Gilbert could refuse. If Rustberg had gone to such lengths to ensnare him, The boyish figure was undoubtedly prepared to secure his compliance, willing or not. Devious and underhanded, but quintessentially Rusberg's way. After a moment's hesitation, Gilbert gave voice to his dread. "So what do you need from me this time?" A sly smile played across Rusberg's lips, sending a chill down Gilbert's spine. That unsettling grin portended something he desperately did not want to contemplate. No. No way would Master Rusberg be that rotten. It's just my mind playing tricks. Yet the gleam in those ageless eyes seemed to confirm his worst fear. "Do you need me to say it, or have you already puzzled out the answer?" Rusberg taunted. With a shaky voice, Gilbert spoke the unthinkable. "You want me to teach the next batch of students about survival." He loathed teaching with every fiber of his being, a fact Rusberg was keenly aware of, which meant the depraved ancient took perverse delight in foisting such torments upon him. To Gilbert's immense relief, Rusberg waved off that notion casually. "Nay, chich. I know how much you despise teaching. Why would I ever do that to you? Nov lb / JNN. His heart had nearly faltered, but steadied again at the boyish figure's words. However, what came next was far, far worse. Leaning forward with a wicked glint in his eyes, Rusberg announced with sadistic glee, "I want you to accompany the next batch of students into the heart of the Dark Continent." Chapter 13 A Gem has appeared Part 1. Gilbert froze, his eyes glazing over as a profound sense of disillusionment washed over him. This was the epitome of rottenness. No. What had he ever expected from someone like Rusberg? Did I truly forget just how rotten this man can be? The very request itself should have been endearing when one considered the sort of man Rusberg was. Gilbert was no ordinary drifter, even formidable ones like Annette and Danzo paled in comparison. Before him, they were mere amateurs. Gilbert stood among the rare few on the continent capable of fighting alongside the former academy principal himself. An amazing drifter, one that has received a true name and was a sage, Gilbert surpassed the likes of Shin and the drunkard Annette by 2 ranks. Drifters of his caliber were a rarity, found only within exclusive clans and private citadels. Yet Gilbert was far more amazing than even those elite few, a consequence of the terrifying experiences he had garnered delving into rifts from a tender age. To Rusberg, he was indispensable, the perfect individual to spearhead a project of this magnitude. If anyone could survive in the heart of a monster-infested wilderness, it would be him. However, for such a dangerous request to be leveled at a man of Gilbert's caliber was nothing short of galling. Even coming from the former academy principal himself, it felt like a deliberate insult, a blatant invitation to march towards his own demise. A terrifying act that only a rotten human like Rusberg could conceive. Part of Gilbert wanted to acquiesce, just as he had initially thought. He was sure this cunning boy hadn't come here without a plan to drag him into this, willing or not. Gilbert was convinced Rusberg's audacity stemmed from a misguided attempt at benevolence. He respected Rusberg, but allowing the old man to demean his value in such a way didn't sit well. For what was this crazy request if not an insult of the highest order? Lowering his head, Gilbert allowed the shadows that had been banished to the room's corners to creep inward, curling around his feet. Rusberg glanced around with a frozen smile as his face contorted into a menacing grin, observing the truly pissed off Gilbert. Hey, you're not going to use that on me, are you?" Rusberg uttered in a fierce voice, lifting his legs as the shadows spread towards his feet. Gilbert's face was heavily shadowed, devoid of any trace of humor or playfulness as his eyes submerged in a horrific murkiness. Rusberg gulped audibly as he beheld the brawny old man's imposing figure. Finally, Gilbert's voice rolled out with a frightening resonance that seemed to make the very ground tremble. "What do you think you're doing, Grand Master Rusberg?" The shadows beneath him spiked dangerously, forcing Rusberg to draw his legs up higher. However, just then, Danzo burst in, swinging his sword in a wide arc. The black steel whistled eerily as it parted the shadows, which hastily retreated back to the corners, shrinking and shivering. Danzo turned to Gilbert, his brows lowering violently. And /o/bell/b//in.c//ohm. "Sir Gilbert, what is the meaning of this? Do you intend to harm the principal in his weakened state?" Rusberg nodded with faint pity as Danzo rebuked Gilbert. Sighing, Gilbert shook his head. "You are as uptight as ever. I hope it does not lead to your own demise." He raised his eyes to meet the grinning Rusberg's gaze, his face turning cold. "I do not trust your ways. At the very least, I can vouch that your intentions are true. I do not have an answer for your request yet. But I will seriously consider it and get back to you. Finishing his piece, Gilbert stood, casting a glance at the cleanly cut groove in the concrete floor where Danzo's blade had struck. The ground of that area was split cleanly in half. Gilbert's eyes returned to Danzo and the tip of the black blade pointing towards the ground. The concrete floor was no ordinary surface. It was a creation of the great Mark Gyberson, one of the Central Plains' finest constructors. Even a master's attack should not have left a mark. He has progressed. Before Gilbert could ponder further, Rustberg rose with a stern expression, though a remnant of his senile smile lingered. You don't understand, Gilly. The old man paused, his smile widening wickedly. What I ask of you is never a request. I mean, we could go the ugly route about this if that's what you want. Rustberg shrugged nonchalantly, his wicked grin making his intentions abundantly clear. I regret the day I became entangled with you. To think I once trusted someone like this. Gilbert looked at Danzo, the corners of his lips turned down as he shook his head a moment later. The poor man was overly committed to serving and protecting the academy principal, despite none having the power to truly harm him. It was an ugly lie that Rustberg was at his weakest after a body swap. Gilbert had witnessed the terrifying might of his power shortly after such a transition. Rustberg was a genuinely terrifying creature, and Gilbert didn't want to dwell on how bad things could get. He knew, deep down, that he would ultimately take this path. He had no choice from the beginning. It was ugly and annoying, but Rustberg always ensured things went entirely his way. Tension hung thick in the air as Rustberg's words were met with stony silence from Gilbert. The brawny old man glared at his former principal with as little vitriol as he could muster. Any more would be disrespectful and provoke Danzo's ire. The last thing he wanted was to pick a fight with a protector when he was not yet back in peak condition. Just then, a heavy tremor shook the entire building. Gilbert's face paled. Even Rustberg's eyes widened momentarily before a dangerously elated spark flickered to life within them, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer. A gem. A gem has appeared. He shouted exultantly. Chapter 14 A Gem Has Appeared Part 2. Instead of retracing their steps, Northern and Annette turned left, following a branching hallway that led them to a set of double doors opening into a chamber. Upon entering, Northern's gaze fell upon two other workers, beautiful women dressed in crisp white tops and form-fitting black miniskirts that accentuated the curves of their hips. Their raven tresses cascaded just above their shoulders, framing faces with eyes as razor-sharp as a dagger's edge. One look told Northern all he needed to know. These were vipers, created to kill with uncomely grace and little else. They offered polite smiles and shallow bows as he and Annette stepped into the gray-painted chamber, the drab color scheme lending an air of cold dullness that made their expressions seem all the more unsettling. Ahead loomed another door, undoubtedly leading to the room housing the talent evaluation machine itself. Striding up to their station, Annette unceremoniously dropped the roughshod sheet onto the table, prompting a slight frown from the hazel-eyed woman. What, got a problem with my sheet? Annette growled, her voice carrying an unmistakable thuggish edge. The viper clearly did take issue, but wisely chose to swallow whatever retort danced on her lips. With a smoothing of features, she straightened the paper, only for her eyes to widen fractionally upon noting the grade bestowed by Annette. Wow. A+. He must have really impressed you. Her counterpart leaned over to inspect the anomaly, eyes going comically wide. Really? Annette gave someone an A+. Kid, you must be a seriously big deal. Northern wasn't sure if the remark boded well or ill, so he simply offered a slight nod and maintained his silence. Well, you gonna answer me and open that door before I smack the shit out of your heads? Annette barked impatiently. Coming right through. The hazel-eyed woman sprang to obey, an eerie smile stretching her lips as she approached the door. Placing her hand upon it, some manner of biometric security was activated, prompting the barrier to slide open with a pneumatic hiss. Following in Annette's wake, Northern stepped through the narrow entranceway, only to find himself in a far more expansive chamber dominated by a towering crystal pillar that pulsed with an inner radiance at its center. As the Viper led them further inside, he noted an array of panels and glowing conduits snaking across the pillar's base, carrying a luminescent fluid that seemed to be the source of the eerie illumination. It's amazing. The awestruck whisper slipped unbidden from his lips. I know, right? The woman replied with a sidelong look. This is just one of the many wonders to be found inside rifts. If you ever get the chance to enter one, be sure to explore thoroughly before sealing it. While she busied herself operating the controls, Northern hung back, drinking in the incredible sight before him with unabashed fascination. After a few minutes of meticulous preparation, the Viper turned and beckoned him over with a warm, yet somehow still disconcertingly predatory, smile. All you need to do is place your hand upon the pillar and use your talent. Northern's gaze met hers, and beneath the polished veneer of beauty, he saw the glint of a killer's feral cunning in those sharp eyes. Just what manner of people made up the ranks of this citadel? Turning his scrutiny aside, he cautiously approached the humming crystal pillar and extended his hand to rest upon its diaphanous surface. When the Viper gave an encouraging nod, he closed his eyes and split his consciousness in two. The moment he did, a strange system alert manifested in his mind's eye. System notice. A large amount of soul essence has been detected. Soul essence is being drawn into the void of your soul. Your soul is growing stronger. He could actually feel something pouring into his very being, an odd, indescribable sensation that furrowed his brow in consternation. Raising his head to seek an explanation, Northern saw the hazel-eyed woman had gone bone-white, staring down at the control panel with hands trembling violently. Annette hovered just behind her, wearing an expression of deep worry and confusion. Both women were transfixed by whatever readings played out before them, their demeanors reflecting a state of utter shock. Suddenly, a hairline fracture raced up the length of the pillar from the point where Northern's hand made contact, prompting the entire structure to shudder violently. Northern snatched his hand back in alarm as the chamber itself seemed to quake from some incredible force, nearly sending Annette and the Viper tumbling to the floor. Just as abruptly as the tremors began, they ceased, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. The two women gaped at the control panel, utterly perplexed. "I don't understand," the Viper murmured, brow furrowing deeply. "Just now, the numbers were spiking drastically. But now it says he has no talent at all." Annette shot a bewildered look between Northern's dual forms. "And he clearly does have talent, a lot of it, by the look of things. Has this damn thing finally gone haywire?" The other woman scowled, deeply affronted by the insult to her precious technology. "It can't have just gone nuts. This crystal was crafted by one of the continent's finest engineers. What other explanation could there be?" "Hey, I'm just calling it like I see it," Annette shot back defensively. "We both saw those numbers rocketing off the charts. That was the highest potential reading ever recorded in this citadel as far as I know. And now it's saying 0. 0 means talentless, in case you forgot. Does that kid look even remotely talentless to you?" For once, the Viper had no snide retort, her conflicted gaze drifting to the ominous fracture spider webbing across the pillar's surface. Such damage should have been impossible. Nothing about this situation made any sense. The chamber's doors hissed open once more, admitting a quartet of new arrivals, 3 men, including Gilbert and Danzo, accompanied by a strikingly beautiful woman who appeared to be the Viper's twin sister. At their head strode the wizened, childlike figure of Rustberg himself, his rapid steps carrying him straight to Northern before faltering to an abrupt halt. The ancient academic's eyes glittered with undisguised fascination as they raked over the perplexing scene laid out before him. Northern arched an inquisitive brow, shooting a sidelong look at the other occupants, all of whom seemed rooted in place, their expressions a mixture of bewilderment and trepidation as they awaited the diminutive figure's judgment. Without preamble, Rustberg stepped forward, reaching out to press his tiny hand against Northern's midsection. His eyes slid shut for a brief moment, then flew wide in an expression of rapturous awe unlike anything Northern had ever witnessed, his weathered features frozen in a rictus of overwhelming exhilaration and delight. Slowly, reverently, Rustberg turned to regard Gilbert, the room's tension reaching an unbearable crescendo. And /o/bell/b//in.c//ohm. When the ancient scholar finally spoke, his voice emerged as a harsh, trembling rasp. This is amazing." Rustberg's eyes seemed to blaze with an incandescent fervor as the reedy words gave way to a vibrant cry of pure, unbridled jubilation. "This is so incredible. Truly. A magnificent gem." Chapter 15 Anomaly. After the dramatic events and Rustberg's theatrics, Northern was eventually issued an official rank card, the standard identification bestowed upon all drifters. It detailed whatever information was pertinent: name, talent class, soul rank, and citadel affiliation if applicable. Northern regarded his own card with a measure of disquiet, not entirely pleased by what he saw inscribed upon it. While he had indeed been evaluated as talentless, the saving grace was Annette's A+ evaluation grade. That stellar assessment would plant seeds of doubt in the minds of any who might dare dismiss him as weak. It didn't make up for the talentless designation, but it was something. Another boon that filled him with quiet elation. After all the turmoil, the diminutive figure of Rustberg himself had spoken with Shin, penning a special letter of recommendation for Northern. He was being offered a fully sponsored scholarship to attend the academy, expected to depart alongside Rustberg in just 2 days' time. Shin had tried to dissuade him, but the wizened former principal brushed aside his protestations with sly nonchalance. Since I am no longer the academy's head, such matters lie outside my jurisdiction. It is imperative that the North boy accompany me, so that I might vouch for him there, you understand. With those words, any further objection from Shin seemed futile. They would have to let Northern go, for the ancient schemer's machinations allowed no other recourse. Knowing his son, Shin suspected the prospect of leaving them so soon after reuniting filled Northern with quiet anguish. They should strive to make the looming separation as bearable as possible. Soon, they arrived back at their humble cottage, Shin slowing his stride to regard Northern with a heavy, paternal gaze. "What is it?" Northern asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I don't know." Shin sighed, shaking his head slowly. "You know how your mother can be. She'll be heartbroken that you have to leave so soon." 2 days. His voice took on a bitter edge. "We never envisioned this at all." Northern's eyes slid shut as he exhaled a weary breath. "I understand, father. I didn't foresee it happening this quickly either. But this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity we may never have again if we let it slip through our fingers. I want nothing more than to remain by your sides for now. But I also yearn to grow strong enough to protect you both and become a man of substance in my own right. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" The words rang with sincerity, yet were still masterful lies interwoven with delicate threads of truth. Shin's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he brushed a sleeve across them, swallowing hard against the lump of bitterness in his throat. "You're so mature, you don't even give this old man a chance to be a proper father. That's just unfair." A small, reassuring smile tugged at the corner of Northern's mouth as he reached out to pat his father's arm consolingly. Continuing down the road, the quaint cottage soon came into view, 3 steeds tethered to the wooden fence that demarcated the modest dwelling. One was a shaggy, coal-black beast that put Northern uncomfortably in mind of the feral creature they'd encountered just yesterday. No sooner had the sound of their approach reached Aisha's ears than the radiant woman emerged, a brilliant smile lighting up her features. That warm expression swiftly dimmed, however, as she took in Shin's somber countenance. The dusky glow of evening descended, shrouding the countryside in a melancholy pall as Shin quietly relayed the bittersweet news, prompting Aisha's eyes to well with sorrowful tears. "Elsewhere. I fail to comprehend your reasoning for extending such a generous offer to that boy," Gilbert said, shaking his head. Regardless of the anomalies, his evaluation clearly marked him as talentless. "By all metrics, he is talentless. But you saw it with your own eyes," Rustberg countered calmly. "He possesses the ability to clone himself." Gilbert scoffed. "It could have been any manner of illusion or trick, an isolated anomaly at best. You cannot be seriously entertaining minus." "Gilly." Rustberg cut him off, his piercing gaze remaining fixed upon the cracked crystal pillar as he idly stroked his chin. "This crystal construct. I gifted it to you, did I not?" Caught off guard by the non-sequitur, Gilbert could only respond with a confused, "Yes. And if I recall correctly," the diminutive figure mused, "it originated from a tier V rift, yes." An odd chill rippled down Gilbert's spine at the ancient's eerily tranquil tone. "Why yes, that's correct." A weighted silence stretched between them before Gilbert felt compelled to prompt, "Why do you ask?" "Gilly." When Rustberg spoke again, his reedy voice seemed to freeze the very air around them. "This crystal is meant to be indestructible. Crafting it required the combined efforts of myself and 2 other vagrant rank drifters to extract it from its primal source." Gilbert's eyes flew wide as profound implications blossomed in his mind. That should be impossible." "Precisely, Gilly." A slow, unsettling smile curved Rustberg's lips as his small hand traced the hairline fractures. "For a mere walker, to inflict such damage should be utterly impossible." The words hung heavy between them as the wizened scholar murmured, "Its essence has been drained by nearly half." Rustberg's smile bloomed into a full, childlike peal of laughter that echoed dissonantly through the chamber as he staggered away from the crystal, leaving Gilbert to gape at him in utter bewilderment. To the grizzled drifter 8 understanding, such an event should have been a dire omen, a potential sign that this unassuming youth concealed abilities and power unfathomable for one so newly awakened. Perhaps he was a foreign agent, a drifter of immense skill masquerading as a novice. Even in their enlightened era, new talents still surfaced to mystify the masses. This should have been cause for grave alarm and thorough investigation from the high mages. Yet Rustberg clearly did not share his trepidation, his manic amusement all too apparent. And /o/bell/b//in.c//ohm. When at last the eerie laughter subsided, the ancient academic turned to regard Gilbert, a deeply unsettling grin still playing about his lips. Gilly. In all that you do, I want you to keep the keenest of observations trained upon that boy. I have the most peculiar feeling about him, it could manifest in any number of ways. But rest assured, I intend to retain full control over whatever destiny awaits him. In that moment, the full, horrifying depth of Rustberg's aims finally dawned on Gilbert. His voice emerged as a strangled rasp. You mean to send him to the dark continent? Without even informing his parents? Rustberg's nonchalant shrug spoke volumes. I care nothing for such trivialities. The boy is special, he belongs among my other special acquisitions. Gilbert's brow furrowed as realization set in like a leaden pit in his gut. No. You're not merely intrigued. You're wary of him, you fear whatever potential he may represent. You want me to either tame him or discard him entirely. Rustberg paused, angling his head to meet Gilbert's gaze over his bony shoulder. The cold, grim determination etched onto his childlike visage sent an involuntary shudder racing down the hunter's spine. I'm pleased you've grasped the nuances of your task, the ancient figure intoned flatly. I expect nothing less than monumental things from you and your team, Gilbert. For all our sakes. With those ominous words hanging in the air, Rustberg spun on his heel and strode from the chamber without a backwards glance, leaving Gilbert alone with his sickening sense of dread and rapidly splintering convictions. Chapter 16 Farewell. The day dawned early, twin moons clinging lazily to the dimming night sky, one hovering slightly lower than the other against a warm, violet glow seeping over the eastern horizon. Northern had finished packing in anticipation of his impending departure to join Rustberg. Needing to meet the former principal at an early hour to ensure they didn't miss their transport, he reasoned there was no such thing as too premature a start time. Or perhaps his eagerness to finally leave the Everonian countryside was making him restless. That errant thought brought a pang of guilt, for the prevailing mood since the announcement of his academy enrollment had been distinctly somber, these past few days painted in melancholy hues. The village folk had turned out in force, bestowing him with an array of parting gifts and well wishes. Among the items was a seemingly ordinary cross-body bag blessed with the miracle of infinite space, whether woven by a skilled engineer or retrieved from the depths of a rift. Marvels like this were not uncommon in their world. Thanks to its boundless interior, stowing his newfound trove of gifts proved a simple task, though Northern candidly discarded a few more useless offerings while urging his mother to remain discreet about the minor ingratitudes. In addition to the cross bag, his belongings found themselves neatly packed into a sturdy leather travel satchel, for Aisha had insisted he maintain at least a veneer of dignified formality. They wouldn't have the world thinking her son some slovenly vagabond lacking even a proper set of clothes. By the time the daystar crested the horizon in all its radiant glory, banishing the twin moons with its warm, golden luminance, Northern, Shin and Aisha stood together outside their humble abode. Aisha's expression was pinched, her lips pressed into a taut line as she struggled to restrain her turbulent emotions. Stepping forward, Northern took her hands in his, offering a reassuring smile before leaning in to place a tender kiss upon her cheek. A furious blush stained Aisha's features at the tender gesture, prompting Shin to glance away shyly. So only your mother gets a goodbye kiss. He huffed in feigned indignation. Northern's lips quirked upwards in a half-smirk as he scoffed lightly at his father's antics. Turning his full attention back to Aisha, he spoke in a soft, conspiratorial tone, I hope it's a girl. And I want her name to be Silver. Aisha's eyes went comically wide as the implication sank in. You knew the whole time. Since the very first day, he admitted with a faint nod. I had my suspicions, but only confirmed them today. If you'd simply denied it, maybe I would have thought myself mistaken. See? Shin exclaimed, elation and pride writ large across his features. You were totally had by our son's cleverness. It was a rare delight to be on the other end of Northern's acute perceptiveness for once. Shin's momentary triumph was short-lived, however, as Aisha shot him a withering glare that instantly robbed him of mirth. He knew better than anyone just how apt she was at literal fireball discipline. Aisha's expression softened once more as she returned her gaze to Northern, bracing him with a warm, sunlight smile. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about it sooner. I wanted it to be a surprise. Leaning in close, Northern murmured with all sincerity, I really do hope it's a girl. Pulling back, he lifted his leather satchel with a remorseful smile. I should get going now. Mother. Aisha blinked rapidly to dispel the sheen of unshed tears as she pulled her son into one final, bone-crushing embrace, whispering farewells and well-wishes against the crown of his head. As the emotional farewell drew to a close, Shin guided Northern away, the pair coming to a halt a respectable distance from the cottage. I packed the soul cores from that black beast we encountered into your bag, he said gruffly. Was going to just sell them and pass the proceeds on to you for spending money. But had a change of heart. The cores of a beast-rank monster command a hefty price, you'll see when you get to the academy. The three of them should bring you a tidy sum to use as you see fit. He pulled Northern into one last, fierce hug, the words emerging as a rumbling rasp against his son's ear. Send letters home, and don't be a stranger on the holidays, you hear. Visit when you can. Northern nodded solemnly, watching in silence as Shin slowly retreated back towards the cottage and the waiting, tearful form of Aisha. There would be no need to travel all the way back to the village. Rusberg's missive had assured him transportation would arrive to spirit him away once his preparations were complete. He said my ride would come to collect me when I was ready, Northern mused, shifting his weight awkwardly from foot to foot as he scanned the surrounding fields and roadways for any sign of the promised conveyance. Fishing the parchment from his pocket, he unfolded it once more, reviewing the brief instructions. The time must be in the early hours of the morning. Once prepared to depart, simply step away from your dwelling, your transport shall arrive without fail. Frowning slightly, Northern glanced over his shoulder at the small cluster of watching villagers, their continued scrutiny only exacerbating the awkwardness of the situation. Why wasn't anything happening yet? He'd followed the directions to the letter. As his eyes raked over the contents one final time, the inked words suddenly blazed into shimmering luminescence, the parchment slipping free of his fingers to hover suspended before his startled face. White-hot flames erupted from the hovering square, hungrily consuming the fluttering note in a spiraling vortex of mystical fire. In the next instant, Northern found himself utterly enveloped in a blinding pillar of coruscating light. For a fleeting moment, confusion reigned. How was this even possible? He'd never witnessed or learned of any ability like. Whatever questions sprang to his lips swiftly fell away as the searing radiance intensified, banishing all from Northern's senses as reality itself seemed to splinter apart around him. That's an S-grade teleportation spell. Shin made to lunge forward, only to be stayed by Aisha's firm grip. Only an evanescent rank could even attempt something like that. In other words, a grandmaster. He imbued an activation trigger directly into the letter itself. She marveled, shaking her head slowly as husband and wife watched the towering pillar of arcane luminance ascend skyward, consuming Northern's form completely before winking out of existence entirely. Books hardly do justice to his true mastery. For several long, somber moments, the pair stood in respectful silence, gazing heavenward at the empty skies where their son had so unceremoniously departed their lives once more. Only when the last ephemeral traces of the spell had fully dissipated did they turn as one, retreating into the solitary confines of their home to await whatever tidings the future might bring. Northern's eyes slid open, only to be immediately greeted by the sight of rich, crimson upholstery, a small but exquisitely appointed cabin aboard what he could only assume was some form of airborne transport. Seated opposite him were two identically garbed women with sharp, obsidian tresses cropped in chin-length bobs, their piercing gazes giving him the overwhelming sense of vipers lying in wait for unsuspecting prey. Another feminine figure occupied the space beside them, long vermilion locks obscuring her features as she dozed with a quiet snore. Closest to him, ensconced in the plush accommodations, reclined a grizzled, brawny man Northern instantly recognized as Gilbert, now sporting a slightly askew set of reading spectacles as his eyes traced the pages of some weighty tome. As if sensing the weight of Northern's scrutiny, the fellow glanced up with a curt nod and perfunctory smile. What in the ever-loving? Northern's mind spun as he drank in the bizarre scene laid out before him. This was certainly not what he'd envisioned when picturing his journey to the academy. Had Rusberg enacted some clandestine scheme without his knowledge? The slightest of frowns creased his brow as he swiveled to regard the silent figure of Gilbert. Excuse me. Where exactly are we headed? Gilbert paused in his reading to turn his full attention upon the confused young man, the edges of his mouth quirking upwards in a reassuring smile. And /o/bell/b/jn.c//ohm. Why, where else? We're bound for Milgard Academy itself. This transport will bear us straight to its colossal walls. Northern could only gape as his gaze drifted to the window, watching the scattered clouds whipping past in an indistinct blur of grays and whites. We're flying. The scarcely voiced question escaped his lips in a dumbfounded murmur. Chapter 17 School awaits. They were in a flying ship, the exterior gleaming with golden plates that caught the sunlight brilliantly as they soared through the azure skies. The body of the airship rolled with the structural supports of black polished wood that had been lacquered to shine under the metal. Long windows of glass ran serially down the sides, allowing the passengers to gaze out over the clouds and the landscape stretching out far below. Inside, the corridors were paneled in the same dark wood as the body structure, giving a sleek yet cozy feel. Plush chairs with crimson cushions were set alongside small tables and lamps hooked into the walls. Cabins branched off the main passage, each one furnished just as richly as a fine hotel. At the heart of the airship were the engine rooms, all whirring gears and hissing steam propelling them onward through the wind. Up on the main deck, few people strolled about taking in the sights or sat in rattan chairs under shade umbrellas. The wind whipped loudly, bringing the smell of rain from distant storms. Crew members scurried to and fro, checking instruments and adjusting valves to keep everything running smooth. Their aviator goggles reflected the glow of the setting sun as they sailed off towards their destination. Northern was on the deck of the ship, bewildered as he took in the entire visage that sprawled out before his eyes. His eyes was filled with enchanting flames of adornment. Just how far has the civilization of this world gone? Northern glanced around with dancing eyes. Now, I'm really looking forward to seeing the academy. Intrigued by the intricate workings of the aircraft, Northern decided to do some exploring beyond the lavish passenger quarters. He made his way down creaking wooden stairs to the lower decks, past whirring gears and hissing pipes releasing plumes of steam. The engine rooms pulsed with mechanical energy, crew members shoveled coal into fiery furnaces. At the rear core of the ship was the crystal room, a sealed room emitting blue lights from the tiny line of space between its metallic door and the wooden wall of the ship. Inside the room was a blue crystal shard, resting in enchanted bindings. This crystal was a powerhouse of soul essence harvested from a rift just like the one used as measuring device. Crystals were just one of the instrumental resources found in the rifts, objects that hold an incredible amount of soul essence. Soul essence at first sight was thought to be an energy flow that originated from one soul. That theory was not wrong, although at a point intellectual awakenings, masters began to think otherwise. However, they soon found out that there was nothing wrong with the theory. From yawns as more about rifts were being revealed, it was the theory became a fact that rifts are the greatest manifestation of souls. It sounded vague and intangible, however, there was no better theory to explain what rifts are. Of course, the fact that they link another dimension to Ul'Tra-el is one thing that made it dangerously unique. Another was that it was a different entity from the linked dimension itself, but if harnessed rightly, rifts had the soul power needed to revolutionize the entire world of Ul'Tra-el to a level of civilization that had never been recorded by other worlds. The crystal inside this room emitted raw magical energy that allowed the ship to defy gravity and propel itself forward. Surrounding the crystal room is the engine bay with steam boilers, pistons, turbines, gears. This machinery helps regulate, distribute, and convert the crystal's magic into controlled thrust for the propellers at the stern and rear. The steam engines are powered by coal furnaces where stokers shovel fuel to heat boilers that drive the steam-powered components. This reinforces the crystal magic with mechanical energy. Towards the front and sides are lighter-duty steam engines for electrical, heating, cooking, as well as cabins, galleys, and storage rooms. There were endless amount of things to look at, to take note of. The people were a sight to behold. Of different regions and cultures, dressed in distinct ways, why some wore neatly tailored suits with Panama hats, others dressed in light tunics and baggy pants and tiny shoes, majority wore fancy fabrics of vibrant colors, be it male or female. It kind of insinuated to Northern that they were more of this people on the ship. He wondered if they were all going to the academy too. The journey continuously became a little bit boring. Since he wasn't much of a sociable kid, he wasn't able to strike a conversation with anyone. His white hair often caught people's attention and they would compliment him heartily. But Northern's reply was usually curt. As the increasing compliments began to bother him, Northern spent more time in his room. After he teleported to the ship, he discovered from Gilbert that all of them happened to teleport into the ship simultaneously, just that his was a little bit later. He was shown to a small corner room on the ship that hosted a small bed and a table standing next to it. On the table was a lamp and a dusty old book. Northern tried to read the book but was unable to, particularly because they were letters he couldn't read. There was nothing spectacular about a book he couldn't read. After all, several languages existed in Ul'Tra-el, of which he only learned two. The common one, Basic, and Kruan, which was his mother's native language. He would have learnt his father's too, but even Shin wasn't at all fluent in it. It was a hassle learning from such a person. Language were vast in diversities. Most clans and families had different languages, but one could say they all originated from the common one. When their histories are investigated, etymology of each words were often found to be more related to Basic than any other language. Other continents also had their own language and an even different common language from the central plain. I should consider delving deeper into languages too, Northern noted internally, still gazing at the strange book he had no clue about. N/O/bel/b/in.c//om. It could be a language belonging to any clan for all he could tell. But the mystery of him not being able to decipher it tempted him to steal it. Who knows, there could be a lot of useful information. Or it could be a total junk. It goes both ways, but Northern's curiosity got the best of him. ___. Northern was woken by the harsh sound of the ship's horn. It was to signify that a stop point was being reached. Immediately he woke up. Someone kicked his door open arrogantly. "Get up, brat. School awaits you." Chapter 18, The Academy, Part 1. Milgard Academy stood as an enigmatic fortress, situated on an island shrouded in mystery, the sanctuary of the Crimson Shadow. This isle lay at the heart of the vast central plain, its existence owing to the eerie sea of smokes that lurked beneath instead of a vast expanse of water. Ul'Tra-el, the realm in which it resided, recognized the island as one of its 9 wonders, places where unexplainable phenomena defied human comprehension. No matter how fervently scholars attempted to unravel the secrets behind these marvels, their efforts proved futile, for the wonders remained cloaked in enigma. As the flying ship approached, Northern peered down from the deck, his gaze meeting the unsettling sight of crimson smokes creeping eerily far below. The academy itself stood fortified, surrounded by towering walls that enclosed its buildings, safeguarding them from the creepy claws of the shadowy haze. The height of these walls was staggering, stretching so high that even from the ship's lofty trajectory, the structures within remained obscured from view. Northern found himself pondering how they would gain entry, wondering if the vessel would need to ascend to greater heights. As if in response to his curiosity, the ship glided directly towards the wall. Northern watched, captivated, as the air sailors skillfully folded the colossal mast and maneuvered the vessel's 3 wheels to direct its course. With the mast folded, the ship appeared less imposing, liberated from its bulky rigging. Suddenly, a section of the immense wall parted, revealing a cavity from which an extended metallic aerial bridge unfurled. Simultaneously, a wide circular platform unfolded, and the ship slowly glided towards it, making a smooth landing. The moment had arrived. It was time for Northern to enter the academy he had long anticipated. His eyes danced with sparks of excitement as he envisioned the wonders that awaited him beyond those formidable walls. Just then, a young lady approached, her raven tresses flowing gracefully in the wind. Her crimson eyes seemed to pierce through all they beheld, exuding an intensity that hinted at a thirst for conquest. Her skin bore a warm, flawless hue, and her jet black bangs framed her forehead, stopping just above her sharp, defined brows. Northern found himself momentarily distracted by the floral scent that lingered around her. He turned to regard her, only to nonchalantly avert his gaze moments later. The girl, too, met his gaze briefly before diverting her eyes, and together they stood, transfixed by the colossal wall that loomed before them. Just how did they build this thing? Northern murmured, craning his neck in a futile attempt to take in the wall's entire visage. The closer they drew, the more staggering its height appeared. The wall, a testament to architectural mastery, had been erected by the most skilled craftsmen, drifters who had awakened non-combat S-class talents and dedicated themselves to contributing to the civilization of the Central Plains. Constructed using an indestructible metal forged from the rare Oregon mineral found only within rifts, the wall was smelted and molded through the fierce interplay of steel and fire by master blacksmiths. Its erection took an astonishing 73 years, with the final structure reaching a staggering height of 9,448 meters and spanning a vast 10,000 square kilometers, an area large enough to be considered an empire unto itself. All 7 kingdoms and 2 empires of the Central Plain had come together, relinquishing this land, for none could breach the impregnable barrier. Yet, the mystery persisted. How had the Academy's founder crossed the sea of crimson shadows to reach this island in the first place? Over time, the advent of flying ships and teleportation had made access to the island more feasible, but the Academy's origins remained shrouded in enigma. Another perplexing aspect was the sheer height of the walls, their true purpose, whether to protect the interior from the crimson shadows or perhaps the reverse, remained a matter of speculation. Northern gazed at the wall with a discerning eye, his thoughts racing. It looks like it's protecting the inside from the outside. Or is it the outside from the inside? He mused, his voice laced with intrigue. As the ship touched down safely on the round platform, a harsh blast from the horn shattered the tranquil silence, its piercing sound nearly rupturing Northern's eardrums. While he instinctively clamped his hands over his ears, the young lady beside him remained unfazed, stepping forward as automatic steps arranged themselves from the deck to the platform surface. One of the air attendants announced, "First stop, Milgard Academy. If you are for Milgard Academy, please retrieve your luggage from the cargo hold." As the attendant's voice echoed, several people emerged from within the ship, clutching their bags. It was then that Northern realized he was not the only prospective student embarking on this journey. Where have they all been? He wondered, surmising that, like himself, they had likely remained secluded in their quarters during the voyage. Scanning the disembarking passengers, he failed to spot the alabaster-haired child and the protector he had encountered at the Citadel. At least Annette, the twins, and Gilbert were by his side, a realization that brought him an odd sense of comfort he promptly tried to shake off. As Northern made his way towards the cargo hold to retrieve his luggage, Gilbert approached him with a smile, lifting one of the bags. "This is yours, right?" he inquired amiably. "Ah, yes it is," Northern responded, slightly taken aback. "Thank you," he added, politely collecting the bag from Gilbert's grasp. Falling in line with the other passengers, Northern surveyed his surroundings. Most of his fellow travelers appeared to be between the ages of 14 and 16, with the exception of a single diminutive figure who immediately caught his eye. The youth was not merely short in stature but possessed blue hair and a cold, piercing gaze that hinted at a troubled disposition. To Northern, the boy seemed out of place, as if he should not have been present. As Northern approached the cavity within the wall, he glanced around once more, but there was still no sign of Rushsburg. While his absence did not perturb Northern, he had expected the individual who had invited him here to accompany him on the journey. If not, how could Rushsburg possibly teleport them into a place he had never been? As Northern walked, someone matched his pace, and a boy greeted him with a slight bow of his head. "Good afternoon. My name is Ellis. Ellis Ruthsworn." Northern regarded him with a deadpan expression, offering no response. "So what about you? What's your name?" Ellis pressed, undeterred by Northern's silence. Northern sighed inwardly. Can't he even get a hint? He mumbled under his breath before answering curtly, "Northern. And /o/bel/b//in.c//ohm." Ellis studied Northern intently, as if expecting more information. "What?" Northern grumbled, growing impatient with the boy's scrutiny. "You must be from the Imperial family." Ellis whispered conspiratorially. "Are you trying to hide your identity?" "Don't worry, not everyone knows about the white hair of Luenigard Empire." Northern arched a brow, his expression puzzled. "I think you have the wrong person," he stated matter-of-factly, hastening his steps to put distance between himself and the persistent Ellis as they entered the hallowed walls of the Academy. What sprawled out before his eyes was a sight more grandiose than anything he had ever laid eyes upon, the magnificent Milgard Academy in all its splendor. Chapter 19 The Academy Part 2. Crossing the colossal walls, Northern's eyes widened in awe as he beheld not a mere school, but an entire city unveiled before him. Towering glass buildings stretched desperately into the sky, piercing it with their spectacular beauty. Each structure was intricately and magnificently crafted, their sharp edges and sickening twists spiraling into an embrace with the clouds. Lush, radiant greenery filled some areas, carpeting the ground, while others were paved with pristine white marble, fit for monarchs and lords. People strolled along these marble paths, some lounging on benches amidst the verdant foliage, others gathered beneath the pink blossom trees, their movements aimless yet purposeful. What united them all were their prestigious white and blue uniforms. Ancient robes fashioned into a modern style, the V-neck collared shirts tucked neatly into long white trousers adorned with blue stripes along the sides. Knee-high boots or sleek shoes were a matter of personal preference, while the V-neck shirts were worn as coats over the ensemble, either tucked in or allowed to flow freely. Some uniquely tied belts around their waists, creating a dashing blend of ancient Eastern and modern aesthetics. For the young women, the attire mirrored the men's, save for the flared skirts that barely grazed their knees. And /o/bell/b/jn.c//ohm. Northern observed keenly as the glass elevator carried him and other students down the wall and onto the grounds. Upon reaching the bottom, they were ushered into another office, where stern security officers took their rank cards and issued temporary school its. Afterward, they were led eastward, away from the main compound. Within minutes, they arrived at a deserted area, beautiful and magnificent, yet paling in comparison to the grandeur of the Central Academy. Devoid of bustling students, it felt like a ghostly field. The students exchanged apprehensive glances as they silently followed the grim-faced officer leading them. Northern scanned the area, searching for Gilbert and the others, but they were nowhere to be seen. They must have been led elsewhere. Perhaps to meet the academy officials, he mused. I wonder why we were brought here, too. Pushing aside his thoughts, Northern consciously followed the winding path. The eastern region was segregated by a large wall, not as tall as the academy's outer fortifications, but formidable nonetheless. Unlike the academy's brownish hue, this wall was stark white, jagged spikes adorning its top. The interior was neatly arranged, with arrays of smaller buildings, their architecture fine but insignificant compared to the main structures they had witnessed. They entered a building at the edge, nestled among the others, and found themselves in a broad, low, and cozy yet chilly wooden hall. As everyone filed in, murmurs rose and fell, slowly dying down as the officer strode to the platform. He tapped the microphone twice, eliciting a deafening screech that commanded silence. Attention, entrance. His voice was rough and brief, his presence demanding obedience and fear. Welcome to the academy. I understand most of you have not undergone the second awakening. Except for the nobilities, I doubt any of you are equipped with knowledge of rifts or drifters. He unfolded his arms and clasped them behind his back. But that should be of no concern. The reason you are in this academy is to prevent you from walking, no matter how much you try. There are walls around to ensure you cannot walk into a rift. Pausing, he pressed his lips for a moment, then continued, addressing them solemnly. However, there's a breakpoint. No matter how much you resist the call, you will eventually have to heed it, or you will go mad. Your incomplete soul core would break, and you'll become a being worse than even monsters. A soulless. The entrance voices rose in a clamor of murmurs, quickly quieting as the officer's stony gaze swept over them. Of course, I am well aware that most of you are probably full-blown drifters. However, there are still some drifters amongst your ranks. You are in the academy to be equipped with knowledge and training for your second awakening. With 2 weeks of rigorous preparation, you will be armed with everything you need to know about rifts and finally thread into the realms of darkness to receive the true extent of your powers. May Ul'Tra-el guide and bless you. With that, he marched away from the stage, leaving the students to themselves. For the first few seconds, confusion reigned. What? That's it. Wait. Are we supposed to? Won't we be allocated a room? This is so weird. Is it even okay for him to leave like that? Who are our instructors? This place is deserted. Several more voices were lost in the ocean of mutters that flushed across the hall. Northern stood silently in a corner, observing everyone. In little time, people had already gathered in groups, talking as if they had completely forgotten why they were there, for the second awakening and to become full-fledged students of the academy. Seeing them brought to mind how comfortable humans could become with anything. But what bothered him most were the academy's intentions and the instructor's abrupt departure. Minutes pressed into hours, and no one came. The students had already settled on the ground, conversing about various topics. Rich nobles were being filtered out, their lower-class counterparts frolicking around them, the divide painfully obvious from their actions. Northern would have loved to gather more information, but he wasn't interested at the moment. Something about this situation felt unsettling. Or was he overthinking it? Maybe they just wanted to give everyone time to get accustomed to each other, he thought, leaning against the wall and slowly closing his eyes. In that moment, a sudden tremor shuddered through the entire place. Northern's heart trembled with fear, unsure if it was merely the shock of how abruptly it happened or if his intuition had been correct. The students sitting on the ground looked around, some standing with deep caution etched on their faces. Something was undoubtedly amiss. Northern lowered his head and noticed a glinting white circle encasing the wooden floor of the hall. His eyes shot open as he traced its perimeter, first walking, then running toward the platform as the white circle began to glow brighter. Somehow, it reminded him of a certain teleportation spell that had been used on him before. Teleportation. He muttered, squinting at the circle. As the word left his lips, a bright light shot forth, bathing the hall in an ethereal glow. When the radiance faded, no one remained. Absolutely no one. Chapter 20 Nonsense Deceit. A somber man walked into the office of a nearby building and sat down. His palm washed over his face with an exasperated sigh escaping his mouth. Minutes later, as he stared himself into a wishful oblivion of what had just happened, the door opened. Another man, but older, walked into the office and sat in front of him, a table parting both of them. It must not feel good, right? What? Lying to a bunch of kids? The officer raised his head to look the man in the eyes. No, it did not feel good one bit. One thing he and the man had in common was the same uniform they wore. It was more like a military uniform but was white in color, black stripes running from the shoulder to the legs. The man had a slightly grim expression on his face and slapped his tongue bitterly inside his mouth. I don't know what to say. As you know, in this world, we are the bottom of the food chain. We are meant to grovel at the mercy of the instructors and carry out whatever orders are given to us. That is the reality of our situation. The guy bit his lip. He opened his mouth after a fresh seconds of silence. It's not even that. He looked up to the man again. Sir Fergo. Something is fishy. I can smell it. I don't know why we were asked to lie to the kids or why they suddenly disappear, but I can smell that something is wrong. And it will do us 100 times good to pay no attention to it. Face your work, Ul'Tra-el. The guy looked down and bit his lips once more. Damn. He smacked his hand on the table. Fergo watched him bitterly and shook his head. He stood up a couple of seconds later, bid a farewell and left the office, leaving the young officer to drown in the regret of ever deciding to accept a job in the academy. There were several ranks of profession in the academy. The lowest rank, workers, these ones are responsible for menial jobs such as cleaning. Officers, these are set of low-rank drifters that work with the protectors to preserve the security of the school. After them existed the junior instructors, senior instructors, heads of department, administratives, vice principal and principal. Fergo had at least wished to become a junior instructor, but because of his low-class talent and insufficient Rifts experience, he was unfit for the job. Hence he had to settle for what he could get. To take care of his sickly mother and educate his sister in a common school, he had to be an officer. So far the job has been rewarding, except from times when they get bullied by junior instructors. Working with the protectors was a privilege, and if Olin would put it to word, he'd say the junior instructors are just jealous of such privilege. After all, a protector is an amazing rank of prestige. To live one's life and family in order to protect the border of the continent is the highest level of service a man can give. And service at such level is respected and appreciated by all. Olin had been struggling to survive in an environment like this, especially when the senior instructors would dump loads of shitty errands like this one on him. He should have never been the one to pass this message, Olin knows. Whatever it was the academy was planning, it was not of general knowledge, and so there's no way he'd be asked to do it. Usually when it's considered to be related to students, the academy keeps it confidentially between instructors. Olin was sure this was an act of disobedience. Thinking about it, a strange fire began to burn in his chest. He wanted to investigate the matter, see what it was about and report it to the authorities. Even if it's despite the instructor that had put him up to it. Olin felt sorry for the entrance, but what's done is done. Wherever you all are, I hope you survive. Under the crimson sky, the scorched earth was littered with the mangled corpses. And /o/bel/b/jn.c//om. Massive, beastly bodies with matted fur and savage claws lay slashed open, their entrails spilling out onto the muddy ground. Among them were the shattered shells of colossal crabs, their legs twisted at unnatural angles and their shattered pincers still dripping with viscous fluids. Northern's eyes fluttered open to a landscape of unimaginable carnage. He found himself surrounded by the gruesome remnants of a brutal war between two monstrous species. The air was choked with the metallic tang of blood and the sickly sweet stench of rotting flesh. Rivulets of dark, coagulated blood snaked through the turf, soaking the trampled grass. Severed limbs and gnarled, severed heads were strewn about like grotesque debris. A heavy, oppressive silence engulfed the ravaged land. Flies swarmed over wounds, their droning wings amplifying the eerie stillness. Northern's own shocked breaths sounded deafening amidst the deathly quiet. He gazed around, horrified and transfixed by the nightmarish vista. The sheer brutality on display was beyond comprehension. What primal hatreds, he wondered, could have fueled such ruthless carnage? How many lives had been mercilessly extinguished on this cursed plot of land? Stumbling to his feet, Northern cast his eyes over the battlefield graveyard. He shuddered at the harrowing sight. A voice interrupted him. A different kind of voice, one he hard once heard. You have entered a rift. Northern frowned at the runes that appeared as Ray's voice delivered its message. A rift. The officer had told them they had 2 weeks to prepare for a rift, and all of a sudden they were transported into one. This is nonsense. Why bother lying? If they were going to send them into a rift, why not just send them? Was it to avoid student from protesting? But lying for such reasons seemed childish, nonsensical to Northern. Plus that teleportation circle that he saw. The light, he was sure it was the same kind of light that teleported him into the airship. If so, was the former academy principal a part of this? That line of thought seemed plausible to Northern. What had just happened bothered him a lot, but there was something else before him. He is in a rift. With no solid knowledge. No training or rift education whatsoever. No weapon. He was unaware of the tier of rift he had found himself in. And he has to survive somehow. Faced with such reality, Northern's bones trembled.